Our guest today is Meinl cymbals artist Rodney Holmes. Rodney has been a Meinl cymbals artist for quite some time now, roughly 16 years, if my math is correct. Rodney came along at a time in our history as a cymbal company in the U.S. when we were building our brand recognition from the ground up. I had just been with the company a little under 2 years prior to Rodney joining, and all that time we were working mostly with artists that played metal and screamo. We had one or two artists on the roster that had a broader appeal, but for the most part we were reaching out to a pretty heavy audience. My colleague in Germany, Norbert, and I were both at the Modern Drummer Festival in 2005, and we saw Rodney perform, and we loved it. That night, at a dinner where we found ourselves with Rodney, Norbert and Rodney hit it off particularly well. I had my hands busy with the two U.S. artists that we had on the festival, so Norbert had time to chat with Rodney and get to know him better. After the festival, the dinner where Rodney got to know about Meinl through Norbert, and after having sent Rodney some cymbals to try out, Rodney made the move from his former cymbal company to come on board with us. His timing could not have been better. Having all of these artists that played metal and screamo was just what we needed, and they were certainly helping to establish the brand. But not every young drummer that was listening to that music was going to necessarily stay with that music. As people and drummers do, their tastes change over time. That was where Rodney was so pivotal. He provided a great place to land for those fans of Meinl that found themselves seeking out something beyond the artists that initially pulled them on board. It was obvious to anyone that heard Rodney play that his technical ability was on another level. But the choices he made musically were so broad, so based in so many styles, that he didn't alienate anyone, and was a Meinl cymbal artist that spoke to those with more refined tastes, as well as to those that wanted to hear drumming that could hit you hard when you wanted that sort of thing. We eventually worked with Rodney to create a few signature cymbals for him: his 22-inch Byzance Spectrum Ride, and his 13-inch and 14-inch Byzance Spectrum hi-hats. These cymbals are so representative of Rodney as an artist. They have that broad-reaching appeal. They cut, and they lay back. They articulate, and they roar. They're still in production, too, after all this time, and those that know about the magic of these cymbals know. Rodney's career as a musician has seen him take on all kinds of challenges, all the while playing with other world-class musicians. Santana's return to the spotlight so many years ago with his smash hit song Smooth, that was Rodney playing on the song and touring with Santana. Rodney released his own solo album that's actually really, really good. And I say the word actually because many drummers that have released solo albums have, at least in my estimation, released some real stinkers, but not Rodney. Worked with legends such as Joe Zawinul and the Zawinul Syndicate, the Brecker Brothers, and Jim Weeder, Rodney's done it. He never quits making music with great musicians. Writing more music and releasing another solo album? He's working on it. In fact, some of the tunes from his forthcoming solo album can be heard in the videos he recorded with us a couple of years back. Just go to YouTube and search Meinl cymbals Rodney Holmes and look for the most recent releases we've made with Rodney. Songs like Hipster Killer, love the name, and Ghost are flat-out great songs that defy genre and hit on all kinds of musical places in your brain that are comfortingly familiar, yet pretty daring at the same time. So I sat down with Rodney very recently to catch up and chat with him about all kinds of things. We actually start the conversation and continue it for a while on the subject of art, illustration, and graphic novels, all areas that are near and dear to Rodney. As you'll see, also not really separate from music as far as he's concerned. Rodney's concern for art, with a capital A, is very apparent, and it's one of the hallmarks of a person who has the kind of unwavering dedication to his craft that he does. Enjoy the podcast. I'd like to welcome everybody into the Meinl Radio podcast. We've got the one and only, the awesome, the super cool Rodney Holmes with us here today. Rodney, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Oh, no problem. It's good to be here.
Yeah, man. I'm going to launch right into it. I've got a few different things I wanted to talk to you about. First of all, you were born in the Bronx, correct?
That's correct.
Did you grow up in the city?
Partly. I was born in the Bronx, and then when I was very young, around 5 or 6 years old, my family moved us to Westchester, New York, in the White Plains, Greenburgh area. and I lived there for a while.
Now, so how far away is that area from the actual city?
It's about a 25-minute drive or a 30-minute drive.
Okay. Now, I know that it wasn't right away that you got into music, but a little bit later on, and so I'll go back to the earlier stuff here in a second, but when you did finally start really making your transition into life, into playing music, being a teenager playing, did being around the city, that area, have an effect on you musically?
Oh, definitely. No doubt about it. But when I was a teenager, it was a mixture because we had moved back to the city, but I was still going to high school in Westchester. So, but I would always go down to the Jazz Cultural Theater and just going out to see people play. That was at that time when I was really taking it seriously.
Now, when you would go see people play, did you ever have the experience of meeting someone you really admired and maybe you kind of wish you hadn't met them?
All right, so are we still in my teenage years, or?
Yeah. When you're a kid and you approach someone, Mr. So-and-so, I really enjoyed your performance. Beat it, kid. That kind of a thing.
Not when I was a teenager. I hadn't run into that yet.
Okay, well, we'll get back to that later because it sounds like you've had one of those experiences I've had, but only as an adult. Now, I was curious just to see about what your biography and your website had to say. I mean, you and I have hung out plenty before, and I feel like I have a pretty good read on you, but there were certain things I wasn't quite aware of. So, for instance, art, science fiction, fantasy, those seem to be, according to your biography, those were areas that had captivated you at an early age, right?
Definitely.
Okay, and so you were really into art and illustration when you were a kid.
Yeah. I thought I was going to be an artist. That was kind of the plan when I was younger.
Gotcha.
I drew and painted and yeah, seriously into that.
Well, so once I saw that that was your background initially, like your main interest when you were younger, I immediately thought, okay, I've got a couple of questions I've always wanted to ask somebody who is probably well-versed in, art history, or at least knowing something about modern art. And you're a pretty knowledgeable dude about many things, so I figured I'd at least throw these questions out there. So, graphic novels. I've read the term. I figure you know a lot about graphic novels, considering you were into art, science fiction, and fantasy, and graphic novels were a big part of that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably not as versed as other people, but I'm familiar with some of the classic graphic novels, particularly like stuff from the sort of mid-'80s, when they really started to have an impact. Like Frank Miller, all the Watchmen series.
Yeah, sure.
But also around that time, transitioning from being a teenager to a young adult, I was heavily into Omni magazine, heavy metal magazine. Heavy metal, not having anything to do with the music heavy metal.
No, the magazine.
Yeah, and kind of graduating out of Marvel and DC comic books and into more adult and more esoteric, stuff. And then, but the graphic novels kind of brought me back to more traditional comics because they were starting to take more chances.
Dude, then you're the perfect person to ask these questions to, because I know you're going to know what I'm talking about. So
I hope.
No, I think you will. Or at least you can give me your opinion, which is going to be every bit as relevant as some factual answer. So I've read that the term graphic novel is more of an American and British term. And I've read that it is, some people have hypothesized that it's used to help offset some kind of perceived embarrassment felt at the idea of an adult reading comics. Whereas in places like Japan and continental Europe, comics don't have any kind of necessarily youthful connotation attached, and it's just a respected art form, and that's it. Would you say that's accurate?
That is 100% true. The Japanese have manga, and manga, adults read manga, and there are many, many, many different kinds of manga that don't have anything to do with superheroes or anything. There's manga about families. There's manga about all sorts of just anything you could think of, and it is a respected art form. And when you have artists like Mobius and Belial, some of the French artists and some of the European comic artists were well respected. And it wasn't until like Heavy Metal magazine, when heavy metal came to the United States, that they started to get more respect here.
The manga artists,
the European guys.
Oh, gotcha.
Like
those guys. Okay.
like Mobius and Belial and those guys. But anyway, yes, you're right. It was way more respected abroad. Here, it was just like you said. It was associated with being with children reading comic books, so they didn't take it seriously. So they did call it graphic novel to give it more gravitas.
Interesting. Now, one last thing about manga, since you brought it up, has that really been around in one way, shape, or form since the 12th century in some iteration?
That I'm not sure.
Okay. I'll fact check that one on my own.
Yeah.
But, I've sometimes wondered, now that we're talking about Heavy Metal magazine, because I remember as a kid in the 80s seeing those, but they were always a little bit more on the top shelf. Not necessarily next to the Playboy magazines, but a little bit out of my reach. And so, I always wondered why. And then I got a hold of a copy and I was like, oh, okay, I think I see why. So I've sometimes wondered how and where the propensity for artists of graphic novels and comics to illustrate the human form in such an exaggerated way, like where that came from. So if you look at the old Superman comics from way back when,
right,
Superman was just sort of average looking, like no muscle tone really to speak of. And then a few years later, you look at Captain America comics where he's fighting the Nazis on the cover of it, and it was almost used as propaganda to help, like, guys
for the war effort. Yeah,
totally. I mean, these guys still had pimples on their faces and they're signing up for the war. And those covers, Captain America's, he's got some muscles, he's got some serious tone.
Right.
So I wondered if it was as far back as that, where the really exaggerated I can't say that word, anatomical, there we go, right, features happened, or was it the emergence of like underground comic illustrators such as R. Crumb and publications like Heavy Metal magazine that really gave it that sense of exaggerated, small waist, tons of muscle fantasy,
that heightened reality? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. I'm gonna guess because I don't know for sure. I don't think that the sort of underground comics of the 1960s, like the R. Crumb stuff. I think that was in the 60s.
It was, yeah.
I don't think that really had anything to do with the more sort of mainstream fantasy comics. In terms of, I think what I honestly believe that they were just trying to sell books. So I think at a certain point they thought, and again, this is a guess, I could be completely wrong about this, but I think at a certain point they wanted to sort of up the ante from the older style of drawing the human anatomy, where they looked a little bit more real. And I think they just wanted to sell more books. If you look toward, like, they just, the the way they drew these people became more and more exaggerated over time.
Yeah.
It was just like you said, the unrealistic anatomical renderings.
Yeah.
And like if you look at the difference between some of the comics from the 1970s and some of the God, I just forgot his name, the guy who invented Spawn. I can't think of Todd McFarlane. Like if you look at some of his artwork, like from the 1990s, like when he used to be with Marvel and he did some really cool Spider-Man books. You look at the difference between the way Spider-Man was drawn just in the 1970s and the way he was drawing Spider-Man at that time with the exaggerated eyes, the sort of like spaghetti-like web slinging, like the way the webs looked and the way his body was drawn, it just became more and more exaggerated. I mean, that's a very Todd McFarlane sort of aesthetic anyway. But over time, I think the books that dealt with superheroes and fantasy stuff, I believe they were just upping the ante to get more eyes on the books. And
Gotcha.
And
that makes total sense.
And they did fetishize the body types more. And
that's why it was on the top shelf. I mean, well, at least Heavy Metal magazine. I would look at that stuff and I'm like, wait a minute, maybe I'm not supposed to be looking at this.
But that's it. So the thing about heavy metal was not for kids.
Yeah.
I mean, kids could get a hold of them, but those were adult sci-fi fantasy magazines with adult sci-fi fantasy stories. And the European artists were, and not all of those artists exaggerated the anatomy. Like Mobius didn't. The way he drew people it could be somewhat mundane, but it was like the context. Like you'd see people with the type of clothing that they wore within the scene. It was so otherworldly, where he would put people that looked so ordinary in just ridiculously fantastical situations, which made it even crazier than making every guy look like Superman, or every woman looking like a supermodel. They really did look like real people, and I think that was something that the Americans weren't doing at that time. They had gone away from realistic renderings of the human anatomy, where some of the European guys did still make people look real. And then you had the other artists that really exaggerated. But not all of them didn't do that. Some did, some didn't.
Yeah, sure. I think the R. Crumb thing that I brought up, it probably what that guy contributed to the whole scene along the way was the ability to have more cutting edge and maybe taboo topics that were introduced into the medium. That's probably why that crossed my mind.
Yeah. No, definitely. And he, I think what he was doing might be closer to the mangas, because the stories were kind of mundane stories about just crazy stuff that happens in life,
Yeah.
And the sort of the dark side of just being alive at the time, and just all sorts of things, but it was just about people doing unseemly and saying the things they shouldn't say and doing things they shouldn't do, and so I wouldn't. Even though there were comics, it was definitely those were definitely underground comics.
Yeah, for sure. Well, dude, I love picking your brain about that stuff. I know probably in 0 drum podcasts that you've done, have you ever been asked this stuff? And I'm totally okay with that, because if I really had to talk to you about this one certain sticking, I think I might be bored to tears. Not because your stickings are boring, but because, like, I like to talk about big picture stuff sometimes. You get a real good sense for a person that way.
Right.
So transitioning a little bit here, walk me through the segue between your love and involvement in art as a kid and the emergence of music and how it eventually took over.
Well, to me, they were sort of inextricably linked. So when I would read comics and starting to read novels, I would always have music on in the background as sort of a soundtrack.
Were they your parents' records at the time, or were they records you were actively seeking?
Both. In the beginning, it was records that my older brother had and my parents had. And then when I could save up a few bucks to get like an album that a band that I like came out with a new album, and I could actually go and buy it on my own.
So wait, tell me, what was the first album you bought with your own money?
Oh, God,
do you remember?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I honestly don't remember. It could have been Earth, Wind, and Fire, All in All. That might have been the first one. Like the very...
Not a bad album.
Huh?
Not a bad album to be your first album that you bought with your own money.
Right. That might have been the first one.
Huh. I mean, I remember my first record that I bought with my own money easily. It was I remember actually going to the store to get it. I did my chores and saved up the money I earned from my chores, and we went to Rose's department store in Cleveland, Tennessee, and I bought Cheap Tricks live at Budokan. I was 6 years old. And I don't know how I knew to buy that record. I must have heard Surrender on the radio or something like that.
Yeah.
And that probably did it. Still have it. It's warped as hell, but it's, yeah. I've got the album artwork on my wall in one room in my house.
Oh, that's cool.
So it was never really either or thing. It all kind of just went hand in hand, and eventually music took over as far as taking more time out of your day.
Yeah. I mean, to me, music and art were the same thing. The music and the visual and the printed word, I didn't separate those things. I just thought all of this is cool. And music was always a big part of that. But at the time, I was drawing and not playing music. And so when I got the opportunity to learn how to play, the music started to take over.
Did you ever go through a period where you would be practicing so much on drums and you felt guilty that you hadn't sat down and worked on your art in a while? Or was it just, it wasn't really a competition, it just happened when it happened?
It just happened when it happened. My mother didn't push me in one direction or the other. I remember, I don't know, it might have been second or third grade, there was an art teacher at the school that talked to my mother about my work, and she was trying to convince my mother to put me in a special art school for talented children. And she said, he's going to be an artist. He needs to be, his skill needs to be nurtured now. And like put him in this special school for gifted artists. And I remember my mother saying, well, I don't want to, basically she didn't want to push me in one direction so early on. And so she basically just said, I want to give him a few years. And if he's still this serious about it, then that might be the way to go. So it wasn't a competition. It was just, I loved art. I loved all of these things, and I loved music, and I just felt that the music needed more of my time. It just happened, organically.
Yeah, sure. Well, talking about buying albums, that was one of the things that if there's any young'uns listening right now, they don't know the magic that we knew about when you'd go to the record store, you'd buy your album, you'd bring it home, you'd sit and you'd look at the album art forever.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me as a kid, like I listened to so many different things, but I remember the album artwork that quite honestly captivated me the most was the Iron Maiden stuff, because the artist, his name was Derek Riggs. Yeah, dude, Derek Riggs. He would draw those things, and there were tons of little Easter eggs within. You could find some kind of allusion to like a previous album within the artwork. And so were there any particular groups, albums that you like really enjoyed the artwork from?
When I was, excuse me, introduced to Yes.
There you go.
What's the artist's name?
Dude, I do not know, but I know I know I can see all the album artwork.
Yeah, I used to know that guy's name. But those album covers were amazing. And there was a friend of mine that introduced me to Iron Maiden, and I was fascinated by those covers. Eddie, I was fascinated by Eddie.
Oh yeah.
And like you said, there were all of these Easter eggs. Parliament Funkadelic had some crazy album covers, and some just ridiculously crazy album covers. The Funkadelic stuff, the Parliament stuff, the Brides of Funkenstein. There was some interesting art. Not necessarily G-rated, shall we say? But
Yeah.
but definitely creative. I don't know. There's so many out. Earth, Wind, and Fire got very creative later on with some of their album covers as well. I like some of the Rush album covers.
Dude, you were reading my mind. I was literally just getting ready to say, while they weren't drawings or paintings necessarily, they used photographs mostly.
Yeah.
You'd look at a Rush album, and there was so much within just a few pictures, like the Permanent Waves album.
Yeah, that is a great album cover.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, Exit Stage Left has they do a little tip of the hat to each of the albums that they're going to be playing songs from on that live record.
Right.
So, yeah, no, dude, you're right, Rush. That was some good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, okay, this all leads me to another thing I wanted to ask you about. You've got such a broad musical stamp that you place on anything you're involved with, particularly your own music that I've heard. When you were here, oh, dude, has it already been 2 years?
It seems like it just happened last week.
I know. You were here a couple of years ago, and you were playing some of your newest music at the moment and in the studio with us, and I remember just how great it sounded. I kept telling you, like, dude, I really dig this. I mean, it's just it's like pleasant, it's daring, it's easy to just kind of sink your teeth into, but it also challenges you.
Well, thank you.
Your music pretty much defies categorization in my mind, which I think is fantastic. And I suspect that if I asked about your very biggest musical influences growing up, that those influences would be as varied as I imagine them being. Would you say that's accurate?
I'd say that's 100% accurate.
And so let's distill it down to like 5. And they don't have to be the definitive ones, but just name 5 completely non-related musical influences that are non-related.
Okay. So we did preface this by saying that they're not definitive, right?
They don't have to be. I mean, if a definitive one comes to mind, please throw it in there.
Okay, I'd say Nile Rodgers and Chic. Rush. Depeche Mode. The Police. How many is that?
That was now Rogers, Chic, Rush, Pesh.
That's 4.
Mm-hmm.
Did I mention Earth, Wind, and Fire?
You didn't within the answer to this question,
Okay.
but previously, yeah.
Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Yeah.
I mean, I could go on. Oh,
Dude, and right
King
there-
Crimson. I could go
okay.
on. I can go on forever. James Brown. It's just ridiculous. That's why it's dangerous for me to start talking about influences. They never end.
Well, no,
But-
that's a great thing.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting, too, where some of your influences influenced some of your influences. Like, there's a whole era of Rush where I think, man, those guys were listening to the Police nonstop on the bus. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, I think I think there's an interview with those guys where they actually said they were big fans of the Police.
Oh, okay. Well, it makes sense. I mean, if you listen to the Grace Under Pressure album, I mean,
Yeah.
they've got their own Canadian version of the Police version of a reggae groove.
Right. Right. I think maybe the most Police-like stuff that Rush did was on Signals.
Yeah,
Stuff like
I can see that.
Like actual like sort of Euro reggae stuff. That
Yeah.
definitely. I think they definitely checked them out and liked what they did.
Well, I'm also curious about something, getting away from influences, moving into your career. Now, you've played with numerous guitarists throughout your career, and quite notable guitarists like Steve Kimmock, Jim Weeder, Carlos Santana. You've also spent a lot of time having played with the Brecker brothers before Michael Brecker passed away, 2 horn players. You've played with Joe Zawinul and his band, the Zawinul Syndicate, like a keyboardist. How is the approach of playing with a guitarist different from the approach of playing with horn players, or different from the approach of playing with a keyboardist? Like, let's just say they're all on stage at the same time. Each one takes a solo. What do you as a drummer do right then and there to adjust to each one of those types of instruments?
Excuse me. Well, I would say that I don't. The instrument in and of itself has nothing to do with my approach. I'm not thinking, oh, it's a piano, so I'm going to play
Sure,
this way.
of course, yeah.
Or it has everything to do with the player and what they're doing with the music. So that determines my dynamics, whether I need to leave more space, whether whether I need to be more interactive with them. If they're the kind of player that where the way they play, they create like a slow burn. It's not just a million notes a minute right away.
Yeah.
So my first instinct is to create a comfortable bed for them and give them some room to say what they need to say. And then I figure out what they need, what the music needs, what they need, if they need me to throw them some ideas, or they want interaction, or they need some propulsion to, I can act as a slingshot for them. It depends on the player rather than the instrument in and of itself.
No, that makes total sense. It makes total sense. I mean, I guess I asked that because I think there's going to be some people listening that are used to playing loud, and that's it.
Right.
And maybe they're young, and right now they're used to playing loud, but maybe eventually they're going to be in more and more in situations where they do need to think about things like dynamics. So that's why I asked if, for you've ever had, aside from players, you've had the sort of sonic mechanics of the instrument that you're playing behind ever determined anything about, how you adapt. but it sounds like it's just pretty much up to the player.
Yeah, I know this might sound overly simplistic, but I mean this. It's really the music. I think if players now would actually, they don't seem to like music that much, or it's just like one thing that they listen to.
When you say they don't like music that much, that goes along with what you just said. They're not like listening to all styles.
Right. They're not just listening. Let me see if I can put it this way. I mean, the way I think of myself as like a giant satellite dish. And, satellite dishes are scanning, looking for intelligent life. And they're not just looking for one kind of intelligent life.
Dude, satellite dishes are having a tough time of it these days. You know what I mean? Intelligent life.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I had to throw that out there.
No, that's you've made a painfully truthful.
Anyway,
statement.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get us off topic. Please keep going. I liked what you were saying. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right. So, I'm looking for stuff that's good. And that can come in all forms. But I think guys lock themselves into a certain way of, their expectations are extremely limited. And they're not curious. I shouldn't make a blanket statement, but a lot of people, just to listen to something and like it if it sounds good, regardless of what genre they think that it's in. And being in love with music first, before falling in love with the drums, was something that happened to me. I just loved the music. And then when I had the opportunity to learn how to play an instrument, I picked the drums. Because I thought it was interesting. It was in the, it was the heart of where the action was. I loved this notion of a rhythm section when I'd see bands, So I thought, wow, that's where the stuff is happening. Like, that's the heart of it. So I thought it would be interesting to play drums because I liked to dance when I was a kid. There was something about the sound and the rhythm. And but I loved music. That's why I wanted to play the drums. But I think sometimes people just like the idea of playing a bunch of stuff on the drums, or they don't particularly love music that much yet.
Now, growing up, when you were starting to join your first groups and play and cut your teeth and get your experience you needed before you turned professional, or at least took your first professional gig. So because you are so well-versed, I'm wondering if you ever did being able to sit in and play with a jazz band ever keep a rock band from wanting to hire you or vice versa? Did you have to keep that stuff kind of like low-key?
I never told rock and roll musicians that I could play jazz. I never told jazz musicians that I could play rock and roll.
Deliberately, right?
Because they made all sorts of assumptions. Yeah. And I never told them that I like dance music or I could do that or that I played with other people. This was in the early days. They just knew me as a jazz musician. The rock guys just knew me as a rock and roll musician. And I just didn't say anything because when it got out, they would always make, ridiculous assumptions. And, or if they knew coming in that, this drummer, he does that stuff. Oh boy. All right. Then they roll their eyes and just assume that, So learned early on not to even talk about it.
I think there's something pretty cool about that, actually, though. Not them being that way, but you being able to do that. It's kind of like you were leading these double lives, musically speaking. It's kind of cool when I think about it. Real secret squirrel, kind of undercover agent sort of stuff.
It was kind of like that. I don't know if it's like that now. I think things have gotten a little bit better now, but it was like that back then.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Well, let me ask you.
It did kind of feel like a double life to some degree.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. I mean, but again, I think it's pretty cool. I need to ask, if you're working with a band that has a particular leader, which you've done, this is kind of an odd question, but it's occurred to me. Is there, with said leader, has there been an instrument that said leader has been playing that's his instrument, that's more maybe at home for you or preferable? Or have you found that the most agreeable band leaders play guitars, or the most agreeable ones play keyboards, or does that not matter at all?
Oh, that's interesting.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's interesting. Oh boy. I hesitate to.
Yeah, you got to be politically cool here, right? Okay, let's do it this way. Let's, instead of saying, yeah, I don't know if we can say anything else. I think that's the question.
Yeah, I'll say this. I'll say this and this doesn't apply to every single person that plays a particular instrument, but certain instruments lend themselves to. Wait, let me start again.
Get it right, Rodney. Come on.
Let me start again. I think for people that play certain instruments, I don't know if it's the instrument that does this, or just like their perception of what the instrument means. That kind of clouds their thinking, or just the notion of being whatever player, like guitar players having this idea of what being a guitar player means.
Sure.
On and off the stage, or drummer feeling that what being a drummer means. So I can't really blame the instrument necessarily, but there are some societal tropes that have existed for decades that I think play a role in guys having these kinds of assumptions. If that makes any sense.
I play this instrument, therefore I should be this way.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And my favorite musicians were able to they avoided getting caught into by those tropes. But so like guitar players, there's it sometimes it's difficult for them to kind of check their ego at the door and just can we just
you're not
play?
telling anybody anything they don't already know, so you can't get yourself in trouble with that answer. That's just universal knowledge,
right? And I love the guitar, but the ones that really have their heads on, they're great.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
Your answer is yeah. No, I get it. You know what? You can answer that question for me when we turn the mics off.
Okay.
Totally different, but I wonder, you have, we've been together when we traveled together or been around each other. It's been at drum related events. Never traveled with you with any band that you've been working with. I mean, that doesn't really fall into my sphere of work. But we've been to drum festivals together. We've been to drum events like PAS, whatnot. So, how do you get along with other drummers? Like, not like how. Like, tell me how. Like, do you? Do you enjoy being other drummers? Do you, as a musician, as a guy that doesn't just play the drums, do you enjoy drummer talk, or do you find yourself getting sleepy?
I think when I was younger, when I was maybe between 15 and maybe 15 and 22, I enjoyed it. But the more I actually just being a professional musician and becoming a better musician, it interested me less and less to talk about something that I do all the time, and
Yeah.
something that's so personal to me, and that's like a part of my life.
Yeah. No,
The discussions just seem to be redundant, and I think, well, if you're really doing this professionally all the time, why would you want to talk about this stuff all the time? I mean, it, you know what I mean? It's so I don't necessarily enjoy talking about drums necessarily. I'll talk about music that I like, or
yeah.
or if something has like a nice sound, or I really like uh, the drum part on something. I said, "Wow, that's a cool part. I like what it's. I dig that." But uh, uh, to discuss um, drumming and sticking, and I don't really know. I don't really enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I get that, especially at your level. I would think that by the time you've learned as many rules as you have, the point is to ditch as many of them as possible in terms of like a literal sense. And you can play by them loosely in the abstract sense, and that's what helps you say what you want to say musically. But then to have to turn back around and talk about those rules again probably seems like an absolute snore when you spent so much time focusing on them earlier.
Right, and if it's someone that's learning, and they're wondering, oh, how can I, do a certain thing, or there's certain fundamentals that they are that might be elusive to them, then I can understand. I can point some things out or talk about it then.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, I remember working with Wayne Shorter, and I remember him talking about, or he was listening to someone talk about playing, talking about the saxophone, and talking about all these mechanical things. And Wayne is just such a genius. I mean, not only just one of the premier saxophone players of our time, also one of the greatest composers of our time. I mean, Wayne's forgotten more about how to get around on a saxophone than most people will ever know. So, guys that sit around and talk about reeds all the time.
Right.
Like, really?
Yeah.
Like,
At that point, Wayne is probably being influenced by patterns of clouds in the sky.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, very much so. And I remember one time he said, it doesn't mean that he practices any less, or he cares about it any less. It's just so personal. It's like, what is there to discuss? This is like a part of his life. This is what he does. So it's not really anything to talk about.
right.
And I remember him saying, practice is something to do, so you you practice so you have the ability to. I'm paraphrasing, but basically he was saying to be able to accommodate the music that comes to you. You're like like a conduit. He says so you
Yeah.
practice these things, but when it's time to actually play, you forget all that stuff.
I mean, dude, it's like you go to English class when you're, like a kid and you're in school and you learn the constructs of the language and the grammatical aspects as far as writing it and also speaking it.
Exactly.
But then when you leave class, you're not like, man, I'm so hip on dangling participles. I just think they're so cool, even though they piss off my mom. I like them, and you don't sit around and talk about that. You just speak and you just say what you want to say, and some people are way better at others than at doing it.
Right.
Same with music. Some people chose never to learn the rules, and it's painfully obvious. But yeah, no one ever like talks about, man, that word "the" is awesome.
Right. Right. It's exactly. So the talking about the music or a performance but it's one thing, but the shop talk is something that I don't necessarily enjoy.
Okay. Well, I've got a couple. I mean, holy cow, man! You and I've been talking for almost an hour now. Time flies when you're having a lot of fun, and so I've got just a couple more questions I want to lob at you. Now, you told me in an email the other day that you've been really busy, and I was happy to hear that. I'm guessing work is picking back up during all this COVID horse hockey, and if so, how's that been?
It's all in the studio. The tracking for people. It's mostly tracking and me finishing up my album. So I've had a pretty full plate.
That's awesome. Dude, I mean, and I'm not just saying this, like it warms my heart to hear that there's work happening. The other day I was doing this app called Clubhouse. I was doing a chat with with a fellow cymbal artist of yours. His name's Calvin Rogers, and he was saying that work has really been good lately, all in the studio, of course, but that it's been really good. He's been shocked at how good it's been. And so to hear him say that, hear you say that, warms my heart. Just good to know, because I feel like there's quite a few groups that really took it up the kazoo when this all went down.
Yeah.
Kids, old folks, service industry people, musicians. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's really, really bad. Yeah.
So it's nice to hear some positive news. Yeah, dude, I'm happy for you. I'm glad that's going better than it has been.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not as robust as it was, but it's definitely. I'm definitely busy, and so I'm just trying to focus on working with the people that I'm working with, and just putting the finishing touches on this album.
That's awesome. Well, that is a perfect segue into my final question. So, dude, shameless self-promotion time. There's really no shame in answering this question as thoroughly as you want. Tell us where to find your music, where to buy it, not just download it for free. Tell us where to buy it, where to support, what you want people to hear. Say, if you want a good representation, if you're listening right now and you've never heard my music before, here's where you go and here's what you buy.
Okay, so my music, I have one album out that I did many years ago called 12 Months of October.
A killer record.
Thank you. And that you can get, I think it's Apple Music. I mean, do they, I know they, do they still sell, they don't still sell whole albums, right? Or do they still do that?
On Apple Music?
Yeah.
I think you may be right. I think it's now gone to, it's like individual songs.
Okay. Well, you can buy individual songs there, but Amazon, you can get it. And you can find all the links to that music on my website. It's rodneyholmes.com. There are also some previews of what's going to be on the new album, Axiom. And that's where you can find stuff. There's also you can also find some of the performances that that we shot in Tennessee. You know, with
the videos we filmed.
Right.
Now, are some of those songs going to be on the Axiom album?
Yes,
Okay.
3 of those tunes are on the Axiom album. Are going to be on the album, so you can actually get a little taste of it from seeing those videos.
Oh, dude, and what a delicious taste it is, man. I loved those songs. When you kept playing them, you were going for just the best take possible. So you'd go through each one maybe 3 times, and it was a real treat. So anybody listening, you can hop on YouTube and search Meinl Cymbals. Just search Meinl Cymbals, Rodney Holmes, and then you'll immediately see, when you see some thumbnails come up that shows Rodney in a studio with wood floors and a big glass panel behind him that looks into a control room, those are the videos Rodney's talking about, and you can hear those tunes there.
And there's also, if you go to my website or my YouTube page, there are a couple of drum interludes that are going to be on the album that we shot, so you can see those as well.
Perfect.
And that's
awesome.
Just Rodney Holmes, the channel. You can link to that channel from my website.
Cool.
And there'll be more coming.
Perfect. Rodney, dude, thank you so much for taking the time to talk, man. It's been an absolute treat.
It was good to be here. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Meinl Radio. If you liked this episode, please head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. We would appreciate it very much. Thanks, and we'll see you soon.